absurd, outlandish, extremist ideas that would have been dismissed as silly 10 years ago are now serious topics for conversation, including among educated and intelligent people. So these arguments cannot be ignored and must be responded to.
Are you concerned about the growing influence of political extremism, hyperpolarization, and misinformation? Well, you're not alone. This is the American Values Coalition podcast, where we explore the root causes of these societal ills and provide you with strategies to counter them. Anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, a lot of these views are getting newfound attention to young folks these days, especially young men, to help me understand where some of these ideas are coming from and some ideas on what to do about it is my friend Mark Tooley. Mark Tooley is the president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy and a graduate of Georgetown University. He worked for 8 years at the CIA, which could mean that he's a great chef and taught at the Culinary Institute of America, or it could mean that he worked for the Central Intelligence Agency and was like a spy of some sort. We'll figure that out. He's also an author, has contributed many chapters to books, and also wrote The Peace That Almost Was, the forgotten story of the 1861 Washington Peace Conference and the final attempt to avert the Civil War, which means maybe he can help us avert the next Civil War. So Mark Tooley, thanks for joining the AVC podcast.
Great to be with you.
So which is it, the Culinary Institute or Central Intelligence Agency?
Well, I can't cook and I never turn on my stove, so it's definitely not the Culinary Institute. I did, as a very young man, work at the Central Intelligence Agency back in the late 1980s and early 1990s.
Okay, so you were a spy then?
Well, whatever you want to call it. I had thought that was going to be my career, but the Cold War ended unexpectedly, and I was left with not very much to do.
I understand. All right, so let's talk about this. I know you've been observing and talking about and writing about on your own podcast and your and the IRD blog. A lot of this, some really horrible ideas that are coming into some of these spaces, and we're talking about Christian spaces, like folks who are making theological arguments, correct, that are very anti-Semitic and racist and all these sorts of things. So what do you just describe for us some of what you're seeing?
I am hearing from clergy and others around the country about the upsurge in anti-Jewish sentiment openly expressed among young men, Christian men, whom they are ministering to. And this seems to have unfolded just in the last year. No one can fully explain what the source is. Obviously, these young men are listening to TikTok and podcast personalities who are inspiring these anti-Jewish sentiments, but frustratingly to those who are ministering to them, the arguments that those of us a certain age would have used against anti-Semitism for many decades just bounce off these young men. They don't resonate, and so we have not, to my knowledge, found an effective antidote to this anti-Semitism that seems to be surging among Christian, not just Christian young men, obviously, but in terms of our interest and for the purpose of this conversation, focusing on Christian young men who are being affected and who are definitely a part of the upsurge in anti-Semitism in our culture.
Yeah, and of course there's anti-Semitism on the left as well, but we're talking about, are we talking about mostly folks on the right as far as the podcasters and such?
Yes, if we're looking at Christian young men, they're almost always on the right. You know, the IRD spent much of our 45 years fighting the religious left, and I suppose we can declare victory in that it barely exists anymore. And so all of the important activity and conversations within American Christianity are almost entirely on the right. And unfortunately, some of that includes anti-Semitism and authoritarianism, and those who openly advocate for some form of theocracy. Absurd, outlandish, extremist ideas that would have been dismissed as silly 10 years ago are now serious topics for conversation, including among educated and intelligent people. So these arguments cannot be ignored and must be responded to.
Do you have a sense of who some of the major figures are and how big their reach is?
In terms of those who advocate some kind of authoritarianism, those who despair or reject liberal democracy, and those who advocate some kind of Christian confessional state, for Roman Catholics, obviously they would be integralists who would like to see the Roman Catholic Church paramount in society, including in civil law. If they're Protestants, they're almost always arch Calvinist who want a confessional state based to some extent on John Calvin's Geneva or maybe Puritan New England in the 1600s. The most important literature backing up this perspective would be Stephen Wolfe's The Case for Christian Nationalism, which argues that this is the historic Protestant perspective, that the church, or at least religion, is established and that civil government is ordained to suppress heresy, apostasy, false teaching, including having the power to execute those who are persistent in their false teaching.
And you're saying that, so it's not their pastors that they're getting it from. You're saying you're talking to the pastors who oppose this, and they're hearing it from their congregants. Is that correct? Who are getting it online?
In terms of the anti-Semitism, it's by and large laity, young men who are in the church, but looking to their online resources. And this is true across the board for all ages. Most Christians in America are not looking to the local church or their denomination as their final authority. They are collating their own resources online, even if they are active churchgoers there every week. So young men are finding these anti-Jewish resources and are deeply influenced by them. It might be secular people. It might be those who profess to be Christians. The names you and I would recognize, of course, are Candace Owens, who's a convert to Catholicism and has said a lot of outrageous Jewish things through her podcast. Tucker Carlson obviously is a part of that mix. He is Protestant. But there are many, Nick Fuentes, obviously, who infamously declared he's part of quote-unquote Team Hitler. He professes to be Roman Catholic. These are the better-known voices, but it's important to recall they have hundreds and maybe thousands of disciples, if you want to call them that, who are online, podcasting, TikToking, etc., who are spouting these ideas, these pernicious ideas.
Yeah, so a lot of, I come across them every week, like people I've never heard of who have bigger reach than we do in terms of their numbers.
Yes. People we've never heard of, and yet they have hundreds of thousands and sometimes millions of followers building up their own separate subcultures. So those are the anti-Jewish voices, the confessional state, Christian nationalist voices. There is Joel Webbin, the Christian nationalist in Texas, who has a large podcast following. And he is also very anti-Jewish and very explicit in explaining so. There's another confessional state advocate, Dale Partridge. Are you familiar with him?
Mm-hmm.
He's very online. Perhaps the most prominent advocate of a Calvinist confessional state would be from Moscow, Idaho, Doug Wilson, who is a godfather of the movement, founded a college there, founded a publishing house, founded his own denomination, a founder behind the classical Christian school movement. Not that most people in that movement would identify with all of his beliefs. And he would be the happier, friendlier, smiling face of that movement. He's very avuncular in his videos, was interviewed by Ross Douthat of the New York Times recently and came across as very likable, but he doesn't disguise his beliefs. He says ideally there should be a Christian confessional state that ensures that the right kind of religion is protected against false teaching.
Yeah, and he was interviewed by CNN and some other places recently. A lot of this attention came because of our Secretary of Defense. I believe he's his pastor or something like that, or some association there. Pete Hegseth.
Right. Pete Hegseth belonged to a congregation in Tennessee that's part of Doug Wilson's denomination. And Doug Wilson's denomination just planted a new church on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., which a lot of, I assume, young conservatives are now attending, and reputedly Pete Hegseth is sometimes there.
And we should point out here as well that a lot of the folks we're talking about don't agree on everything. So I know that Doug Wilson, for instance, has repudiated the racism of Nick Fuentes. So there are some conflicts even within this network.
Yes, and Doug Wilson would repudiate anti-Semitism. And although he had previously spoken at a conference put on by Joel Webben down in Texas, that was several years ago, and I'm pretty certain he would reject what Joel Webben has been saying about Jewish people the last couple of years.
So for pastors or ministry leaders, people who might lead a small group, who are listening to this podcast, what are some things that the local church should be doing about this issue?
That's a difficult question to answer because there is no readily available antidote to these perspectives. And the young men who are especially susceptible to these perspectives, whether it's the anti-Jewish ideas, whether it's authoritarianism, whether it's having a Christian confessional state, again, they're being fed online. They're not looking to the local church as their primary teaching resource. The local church obviously needs to try to counteract these movements, and I suppose the best way to do that is simply to present the gospel that all people are created in the image of God, and that in civil society that the government and society should treat all people in a legal sense equally without regard to their religion. And that has been the glory of the United States based on our Constitution, that there is no state establishment of religion, and we're all equal citizens no matter what religion, or even if we have no religion. But we used to, until recently, simply assume that that assumption was in the bloodstream of nearly all Americans, and that's now contested. And so we have to be very explicit and start with basic principles and explain why we believe all should be equal in civil society.
As I hear you say that, it just strikes me about how ironic it is that a lot of these folks will appeal to our heritage and our Christian heritage when defending themselves, and at the same time be so ready just to toss out the best parts of our Christian heritage, which is the freedom of religion and pluralism and these sorts of ideas.
Well, that's right. They would often claim to be arch patriots, and there is also the movement I'm sure you're familiar with called the Heritage Americans, who would claim to trace their ancestry back to the American Revolution or before. They are proud Anglo-Protestants whose ancestors came from Great Britain, or at least Northwestern Europe, and they would say that they're as descendants of the original settlers of the Americas, or of North America, they should have a place of privilege in American society, and they're willing to tolerate those who are not white, those who are not Protestant, those who are descended from later immigrants, but those other groups need to accept the supremacy of the original Anglo-Protestants.
Yes, I've only come across this word recently, or maybe it is new. This heritage American idea, which now I'm seeing more and more of, um, and yeah, and so it's like the Northern Europeans are more American. Have they are the ones that you can't trust anybody else basically, which means that Antonin Scalia, as an Italian American, probably wouldn't qualify because that's Southern Europe. But yeah,
yes, the heritage Americans will grant that they're willing to accept Black Americans whose ancestors were here, of course, in the 16 and 1700s, and who are overwhelmingly Christian, but they have to accept the superiority of the dominant white culture, and they will accept the descendants of the Irish Catholic immigrants of the 19th century who have been here a while and are, after all, mostly Christian. But the 20th century immigrants, maybe coming from south of the border or coming from historically non-Christian countries, well, we're not so sure about them.
Yeah, and if you are a pastor or know a pastor and you're listening to this, we do offer a network for pastors called J29 Coalition, which you can find at j29coalition.com. And we are currently taking applications for our next J29 cohort. So go ahead and look that up, j29coalition.com, and we will help you with strategies for the political discipleship of your church. Another interesting thing I noticed you writing about is how within this community, there's now like this Protestant-Catholic fight going on, which is like, oh my, Catholics and Protestants are back at it again. When did this happen? You wrote about this Insurrection Barbie post. Did I get the name right? Insurrection Barbie? Yeah, so tell us a little bit about what's going on with this community that's fighting over Israel and Catholics versus evangelicals. Try to help us understand this.
The Catholic integralist and the Protestant confessional state Christian nationalist advocates are agreed in terms of being illiberal or post-liberal, and in rejecting liberalism, rejecting liberal democracy, rejecting religious freedom for all. They prefer a more authoritarian society that points to, quote unquote, the common good. But the integralists are Catholics, and the Christian, self-identified Christian nationalists are Protestant, almost always Calvinist. So they have some profound religious and cultural differences, and some of that has come out online. Obviously, the integralists want the Roman Catholic Church specifically to be established, or the supreme authority in civil society. The Christian nationalists point to a vaguer, more ecumenical Christian establishment that insists on the Trinity and the deity of Christ, and basically makes Jews and others second-class citizens. In terms of attitudes towards Israel and Jewish people, there is anti-Jewish sentiment in both communities, but recently those who are integralists and those who are Roman Catholic, maybe not specifically integralists, but adjacent to it, who are post-liberal Catholics, have been speaking out strongly denouncing Protestant Christian Zionists, denouncing Christian Zionism as a heresy intrinsically at odds with the teachings of the Catholic Church, which is a very confusing sentiment to make, because a Christian Zionist is just a Christian who believes the Jewish people have a right to a homeland. Some Christian Zionists are dispensationalists, and their Zionism is based on the John Darby system of the Jewish role in the end times, laid out in what people know best through the rapture literature. But dispensationalism still exists, but it's not nearly as influential as it would have been 20 and 30 years ago. And most Christian Zionists are not dispensationalists. You can be a Roman Catholic and be a Christian Zionist. Of course, you can be an atheist or a non-religious person and still be a Zionist. Many, probably most Jewish people around the world are Zionists. Obviously, they're not Christian, and many of them are not religious. So that's confusing, but it has brought out some ruptures between the illiberal Protestants and the illiberal Roman Catholics.
Yeah, and this this could get really confusing for folks outside the evangelical community. And I think when I see folks on the left write about this stuff, they really get a lot of category confusion here. And like you said, being a dispensationalist and being a Zionist, those aren't perfect overlaps. And so I keep hearing dispensationalist used as a synonym for Zionist, but those aren't exactly the same thing. And then at the same time, it's sometimes used as a slur. But in this fight, the group that's not anti-Semitic are the dispensationalists, right? So that could get confusing for our friends on the left as well. It's like, and the anti-Semites are actually opposing the dispensationalists the same way that folks on the left are, right?
Well, that's right. And another confusion is the confessional state advocates who proudly self-identify as Christian nationalists are definitely not Christian Zionists, not only rejecting dispensationalism, but they think that the Jewish people have no further role in the providence of God. And some of them incline towards anti-Jewish views, even overt anti-Semitism, Joel Webben being one example. But there are other people who are labeled Christian Zionists because they're God and country people, and maybe they would be open to some kind of legal establishment of Christianity, but they are Christian Zionists and very strong supporters of Israel. So you have that tension as well. Well, obviously, the Iran war is bringing all of these debates and arguments and perspectives to the fore, and if anything, it will amplify the anti-Jewish sentiment among many of these post-liberal Christians who believe this confirms their conspiracy perspective that Israel and Jewish people in America are manipulating American society, government, especially foreign policy. And I have heard from pastors who hear from these young men who think that they're economically disenfranchised, partly because of American foreign policy and its involvements around the world and its military conflicts. And this is all being orchestrated in some sense by Jewish people. And so that reinforces their anti-Semitic sentiment.
Yeah, and of course, anytime we have major conflicts in the Middle East, we see an increase in the sort of end times literature genre, which has sold a lot of books. I was a young evangelical during 90s evangelicalism, which I think was probably the height of this popularity of a lot of this stuff. I agree with what you're saying, though. I think there has been a decline in the popularity of a lot of this end times beliefs and talk and discussion. And it's mostly like my generation or older of evangelicals where you get it from. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we've seen a trend among younger evangelicals where it just doesn't have that much play anymore?
It's hard to explain. There is that book on dispensationalism written by Dan Hugger that you probably are familiar with that lays out the history. But when I was a boy and young man, you would have had Pat Robertson hosting the 700 Club every day. And anytime there was something eventful in the Mideast, he would be linking it directly to an end time scenario. There's no national broadcaster that replicating that today. And the Iran war would be a perfect time to be making these supposed connections between contemporary events and the end times. But I'm not hearing many Christians making those arguments. I think it's hard to find a dispensationalist under the age of 45 or 50, and very rare among 20-somethings. And even, if I understand it correctly, the major seminary that once would extol dispensationalism no longer does so. So you can still find it online, and it's still a default position for many age 65 and older evangelicals who just assume this is quote unquote the biblical perspective without thinking it through. But interestingly, you have people now like the preacher very close to President Trump, Donna White Cain, who she may have some dispensationalism in her smorgasbord of beliefs, but she's much more a dominionist and a prosperity gospel advocate, and not very concerned about the end times, but much more concerned about political power, winning elections, making the right connections in government, and also ensuring prosperity for God's people. And so if you're focused on winning elections and real estate deals and prosperity, that tends to take your attention away from the end times.
That's right. If Jesus is coming tomorrow, then, what's the point of going out to vote, right?
Or making a lot of money.
Yeah, good point. All right, Mark Tooley, thanks for joining the AVC podcast. So for folks, talk about where they can find you, your writing, your podcast, any other information you'd like to share?
Yes, they should go to our Institute on Religion and Democracy website, which is theird.org, theird.org, and linking to that is our Foreign Policy Christian Realism journal, Providence, which also addresses these issues we've discussed.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate your attention to these pressing issues.